of 2002, the Odisha riots of 2007, all exposed the vulnerability of India's religious minorities. Upon the thousands of lives that were lost as a result of these acts of violence, countless thousands have been displaced. At issue today, however, is that we observe a troubling trend line. Instead of broader reconciliation in Indian society since these attacks, we're witnessing deeper divisions. Instead of conclusions of justice for the victims of large-scale communal violence, we're instead witnessing signs of a climate of impunity developing within the Indian judicial system. Instead of a rise in secularism, we're witnessing signs of intimidation and harassment. Instead of a commitment to stronger laws and enforcement mechanisms to protect the rights of religious minorities, we witness a rise in anti-conversion laws that, although engineered to blight communal violence and force conversions, instead create environments with increased instances of harassment and intimidation. And these trends are troubling indeed and have been verified by numerous organizations. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom contends that, quote, in the past year, progress in achieving justice through these structures for the victims of past incidents continued to be slow and ineffective, end quote. It also finds that members of religious minority communities, especially Christians and Muslims, reported an increase in intimidation, harassment, and violence during the reporting period, particularly in states with anti-conversion laws. India's Home Ministry reported a major surge in communal conflict in 2013, attributable in part to impending 2014 elections when 823 incidents left 133 people dead. Furthermore, a 2012 report by the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life found that India falls into a high category for government restrictions on religion and a very high category for religious social hostilities. Our government has noticed these unrest in the most recent large-scale act of communal violence after lethal attacks on Christians erupted in Odisha in 2008 in an apparent retaliation for the murder of a Hindu leader. Mobs burned churches and Christian buildings, leaving at least 38 dead and 50,000 more homeless, by one estimate. At that time, U.S. officials urged the Indian government to protect religious freedom throughout the country. Perhaps even more disturbing, we have witnessed alarming instances of terrorism by both the Muslim Indian Mujahideen and militant Hindu nationalist groups. Clearly, all of Indian society is being affected by indisputable rise in religious intolerance at the very least, and religious violence at the very worst. Given these trends, it is right and responsible and of better strategic interest to our government to examine these incidents and recommend policies that can help alleviate the harm being done. In the context of India's elections, the trends of harassment, intimidation, impunity, and violence harm the participation of minorities. Decades of communal violence have left many marginalized from society. Furthermore, it is at this time when political parties may use religious divides to bolster their political platforms and energize their voting base that our administration engage with the Indian government. Our government should not turn a blind eye to any religiously motivated harassment or violence intended because it is being perpetrated during an election. Doing so does nothing to ensure India's elections are free from influence. It only discourages that prospect. I've been to India and witnessed blood-spattered walls as a result of communal violence. I've met with countless victims of riots, and I've yet to come to the conclusion that justice has been done. Thus, I have yet to conclude that our work in pressing the Indian government on these issues is done. I'm glad to be joined by our witnesses here today, and I look forward to hearing their testimonies and recommendations. I'll introduce them at this time. Dr. Christina Lantos is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. She is also Vice Chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. In addition to managing the Lantos Foundation, Dr. Lantos teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University. Thank you for joining us this morning, Doctor. Mr. John Sifton, this is the order I have them, not necessarily in the order that they'll speak. Mr. John Sifton is the Asia Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. He has worked on human rights issues in South Asia for over 12 years. Mr. Sifton's organization, Human Rights Watch, has worked on human rights issues in India for decades and has written seminal reports on religious and communal violence, including a key report on the 2002 riots in Gujarat entitled, "We Have No Orders to Save You." Robin Phillips is the Executive Director of the Advocates for Human Rights. She has written extensively about human rights, including trafficking in women, employment discrimination, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. She has taught courses on human rights at the University of Minnesota Law School and University of St. Thomas Law School. And lastly, John Dayal is a noted writer and activist from India. He is a member of the Indian government's National Integration Council, is also the Secretary General of the All India Christian Council, as well as the National President of the All India Catholic Union. So thank you all for joining us. It should be noted that the witnesses here today have been invited to reflect the scope of this hearing and to reflect the voices of minorities that may find difficulty raising concerns elsewhere, which is in keeping with prior practices of this commission. Others have asked to be heard, and I am submitting for the record statements from Congressman Falomavega and Congresswoman Edwards, and entering for the record statements from the Hindu American Foundation, the United States India Political Action Committee, and the Sikh Coalition. Do I have all of them? Yep. And with that, I'd recognize the co-chair, gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, for an opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, thank you for chairing the hearing today and for your long work on behalf of human rights around the world. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Congressman McGovern and Congressman Frank Wolf for being the chairs of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and agreeing to this important hearing. We have an excellent group of witnesses today, and I am particularly pleased to acknowledge Robin Williams from the Advocates for Human Rights, an organization in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which reflects the high value my constituents place on human rights in Minnesota and around the world. Thank you for being here. Let me thank all the panelists for being here. I hope you won't begrudge me for having a special hello for my hometown buddy. And also let me begin by saying how much I value the United States' strong relationship with India. India and the United States have close ties, are allies and friends because we both share democracies and are blessed with rich diversity. Both of our countries have struggled against colonialism to gain independence and freedom. Indian leaders and humanitarians like Gandhi inspired my own path toward public service. It would be a mistake to view this hearing or any hearing by the Lantos Commission as a way to criticize a particular government or individual. That is not why we're here today. The purpose of the commission is to investigate whether universal standards of human rights are upheld around the world. Recent Tom Lantos Commission hearings have focused on human rights issues in Turkey, Vietnam, Northern Ireland, and Burma. Today, we turn to the status of religious minorities in India. I personally became interested in this issue by a friend and a coworker who happened to be in Gujarat in 2002. He witnessed the religious riots that happened and claimed the lives of more than 1,000 people, and traveled through makeshift checkpoints where our men asked if there were any Muslims in the car. On a visit to Ahmedabad a decade later, he found the city was still deeply divided and that the population was still polarized. The purpose of today's hearing is to better understand unfortunate incidents of religiously motivated violence around the world, and that includes the United States and it includes India in the recent past, and to examine the current status of religious minorities in the country, including that of Christians, Sikhs, Muslims, and others. No country has a perfect human rights record, including the United States. There are a number of issues in our own country that I think bear examination and scrutiny, and I've raised these issues, and I look forward to the testimony today. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, for such time she may consume.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be able to provide some commentary on this, this resolution and this hearing. I have grave concerns about the timing of this hearing, considering that the national elections in India begin on Monday and continue through until May 12th. I feel that the goal of this hearing ultimately is to influence the outcome of this election, which is something that I don't feel is appropriate for us here in the United States Congress to do. I think when we look to the opportunity to strengthen our relationship with India, this is something that could potentially undermine the shared interests and the shared values of democracy that we have. The United States of America should always stand up for freedom of religion for all people in all countries, and we will always work towards that end. In that regard, we need to be especially careful not to directly or indirectly contribute to sectarian strife in India or in other countries. I'm concerned that an outcome or effect of this hearing could begin to foment such fear and loathing used for political purposes that we've seen occur in other places, and that it is being done in the end to influence the outcome of India's elections. I look forward to the conversation that we have in a way that will be constructive, both for our shared interests with India, but also to make sure that we are fighting against religious persecution in all countries. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. And now goes to our first witness, Dr. Sweat. Welcome. Thank you for coming and recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And I want to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding this hearing on the plight of India's religious minorities. And of course, I must add that for me, it is always a very special and deeply meaningful occasion to testify before this particular congressional body. India is a religious and pluralistic society with a Hindu majority, the world's third largest Muslim population, and a Christian population exceeding 25 million, and it is home to numerous Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Zoroastrians, Jews, and Baha'is. India and the United States share a commitment to democracy and multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, and India is an important ally with economic, political, and regional value to our nation. Yet, India has serious human rights and religious freedom problems. The State Department's 2013 Human Rights Report detailed police and security force abuse, torture and rape, and widespread corruption and impunity because of a lack of accountability due to weak law enforcement and an overburdened and under-resourced court system, among other factors. Regarding religious freedom, NGOs and religious communities report increasing religiously motivated violence and harassment, and that some politicians deploy religiously divisive language to mobilize constituencies for the upcoming general election, and religious bias and corruption hinder the protection of and justice for religious minorities. Users' concerns about religious freedom in India are reinforced by reports this past year of increases in communal violence, including Hindu-Muslim violence in Uttar Pradesh and violence at a Christian and Muslim Dalit rally, an attack on a Buddhist complex, along with Pakistani Hindus seeking safe haven, being ill-treated, and facing serious governmental discrimination. Also troubling are anti-conversion laws, known officially and ironically and frankly misleadingly as Freedom of Religion Acts, implemented in states which together comprise 1/3 of India's massive population. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Heiner Bielefeld, has rightly deemed these laws as, quote, an obstacle to religious freedom. They violate international standards and inappropriately allow the government to assess the validity of individual faith decisions. They are one-sided and discriminatory, imposing burdens and penalties for converting out of Hinduism, but not towards it. And they trigger increased intimidation, harassment, and violence, particularly against Christians and Muslims. With few arrests and no convictions, they foster a climate of impunity and have led to police harassment. Accusations of forced conversion often are used against religious minority communities on issues unrelated to religion, such as land disputes. Also troubling are periodic outbreaks of large-scale violence against religious minorities, with justice delayed or denied for past incidents targeting Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs, further fueling a climate of impunity and exacerbating social and religious tensions. To address the Gujarat and Odisha violence of 2002 and 2007 and 2008, respectively, India established fast-track courts, special investigative teams, and independent commissions. However, they have been used inconsistently, and their impact remains limited by corruption, an insufficient capacity to investigate and prosecute cases, an antiquated judiciary, and religious bias, particularly at the state and local levels. In addition, there remains little movement toward prosecuting perpetrators of the 1984 anti-Sikh riots. This is a critical time for India. Newly elected parliamentary representatives will select India's next prime minister and president. Many religious minority communities fear religious freedom will be jeopardized if the BJP wins and the Gujarat Chief Minister Narendra Modi becomes prime minister. We hope that is not the case. USERV has a long-standing concern about the BJP's and Modi's association with Hindu ultranationalist groups, as well as allegations of his complicity in the Gujarat riots. In 2005, the U.S. Department of State agreed with USERV and others to utilize an IRFA provision to revoke Modi's tourist visa. While a lower Gujarat court found Minister Modi not responsible for the death of a Muslim Congress Party leader who was burned alive in 2002, other cases implicating him for involvement or complicity in the 2002 violence continue. While USERV's concerns about Minister Modi are ongoing, our ultimate focus is not on him, but on India's broader and continued failure to uphold religious freedom and its responsibility to remedy the situation. I'd like to briefly touch on a few recommendations. USERV has reported on India for some years, but we've never been granted the requisite visas to visit. USERV was denied visas in June 2009, and since then has made inquiries about traveling there, but to no avail. USERV had recommended from 2002 and 2004 that the State Department designate India a country of particular concern, or a CPC, which is the highest designation we can give in terms of our concerns about religious freedom in a country. And that was for its systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. From 2005 to 2008, it was neither a CPC nor a Tier 2 country. And from 2009 to the present, India has been on USERV's Tier 2 list of violators. When USERV releases its 2014 annual report by May 1st, we will announce India's current listing at that time. Since 2004, the U.S. and India have pursued a relationship based on shared energy, security, and terrorism concerns, and shared values of democracy and rule of law. Within the context of this very important relationship, we believe the U.S. Congress should, first, encourage the State Department to elevate religious freedom concerns in the relationship, particularly in the ongoing U.S.-India bilateral strategic dialogue. Second, during delegation visits, examine religious freedom conditions for all faiths and beliefs and meet with individuals and organizations that promote religious freedom as well as targeted religious communities. And we hope that people will visit areas, as it sounds you have, Chairman Pitts, that have been affected by religiously motivated violence. Third, we encourage and we welcome hearings such as this supporting religious freedom that underscore its many dimensions. And we encourage you to support legislation promoting religious freedom. H.R. Res. 417 rightly praises India's religious diversity and commitment to tolerance and equality, and rightly reaffirms India's need to protect religious minority rights. My written testimony includes additional recommendations. Let me conclude by saying that because of the values and interests we share, we should boldly and firmly encourage the Indian government to uphold and protect religious freedom and related rights for all of its people. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. And now we've been joined by the gentleman from Arizona, another executive committee member, Trent Franks, gentleman from Arizona. Chair, recognize Mr. Franks for anything you'd like to say.
You know, I come to a lot of these meetings simply because I believe that religious freedom is the foundation of all other freedoms. And it's always pretty impressive that I see some of the same faces. There's a great deal of commitment in this area. And I want you to all know that we take your concerns as seriously as anything that we consider here. Because without freedom, without religious freedom, there is no freedom. Without freedom, that the human spirit is contained. And I really appreciate what you're doing here. Somewhat familiar. I have traveled to India, very familiar with the situation in Gujarat, and grateful for your ongoing and deep and abiding commitment. And I wish so badly that we could only do one thing around here at a time. But I do have a classified hearing that I have to go to very soon, so please don't consider that any lack of commitment to what you are all doing. And I am convinced that there are people across the world now and in the future that will walk in a greater light of freedom, religiously and otherwise, because of the gallant commitment and effort that you've all put forward here today and continue to do so as we've been able to see for so long. So God bless you and thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Again, thanks him for his leadership on this issue. Now recognizes Ms. Phillips for your opening statement, such times you may consume.
Thank you very much. I'd like to echo thanks to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding this hearing today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Robin Phillips. I'm the Executive Director of the Advocates for Human Rights. For 30 years, the Advocates has worked with diaspora communities, people living outside their country of origin or ancestry who retain ties and interest to that country. Some come to the United States seeking asylum after fleeing religious persecution. Others come as professionals or students or to join family members. And some are second or third generation immigrants. They are part of our communities, they are your constituents, and their voices should help inform our policies toward their countries of origin. The Indian diaspora groups with whom we work have consistently expressed concern about religious freedom in India. We share their concerns, including communal violence, impunity for the instigators of such violence and those in government who may be complicit, anti-conversion laws, vague anti-terrorism laws that facilitate profiling and persecution of Muslims, police and armed forces practices such as encounter killings and torture targeting Muslims, and a culture of impunity for such practices. These practices, which are described in greater detail in my written statement, violate international human rights standards. Consistent with the concerns we hear, the Pew Research Center recently ranked India as a country with very high social hostilities involving religion and high government restrictions on religion. Indian diasporans around the world have been sounding the alarm as the elections approach. In the first 8 months of 2013, there were 451 incidents of communal violence, up from 410 in all of 2012. The UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, excuse me, cautions that political exploitation of communal distinctions presents a real risk that large-scale communal violence might happen again. Impunity fuels communal violence. This impunity is multifaceted. Officials do not hold private parties accountable for communal violence. Courts do not hold government officials accountable for sanctioning or encouraging that violence. Political parties rally behind leaders who are implicated in communal violence. Obstruction of justice and witness intimidation are commonplace in court procedures. Immunity laws shield security forces from accountability, and officials accept torture and extrajudicial killings as the norm. Some examples raised by Indian diasporans highlight these points. Cases brought against officials alleged to be complicit in the 2002 Gujarat violence have been dismissed for lack of evidence after witnesses were intimidated and prosecutors and judges effectively stood in as defense counsel. UN human rights bodies have described the proceedings as flawed from the outset, reflecting concerns of religious bias and high levels of corruption. Whistleblowers in Gujarat law enforcement have faced threats and arrests. The UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women visited India last May. She observed that communal violence in India is frequently explained away by implying that equal aggression was noted on both sides. By characterizing this violence as riots, the government denies the lack of security for religious minorities, disregarding their right to equal citizenship. This issue is of particular concern to many, the Special Rapporteur noted at the end of her visit last May, as the wounds of the past are still fresh for women who were beaten, stripped naked, burnt, raped, or killed because of their religious identity in the Gujarat massacre of 2002. In some communal attacks, police reportedly arrest victims and protect the attackers, and the government has been negligent in its duty to displace victims by communal violence and who are afraid to return home. These internally displaced persons continue to languish in some subhuman conditions in isolated settlements. Human rights defenders report serious problems with increased police harassment and arbitrary arrest and detention of Muslims based on false charges of terrorism. Religious minorities have been targeted under an anti-terrorism law that expands the definition of terrorism, authorizes warrantless search, seizure, and arrest, and allows detention without charge for up to 180 days. While in custody, many suspects are also subject to torture and ill treatment. The independent Ravi Chandra Commission reported that Muslim men were held without charge for several weeks at illegal detention centers and tortured to extract forced confessions of terrorism offenses. In my own personal discussions with Indian police officers, they have been alarmingly candid about their use of torture as a legitimate interrogation technique, signifying a complete disregard for international standards and confidence of impunity for these human rights violations. Not surprisingly, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture's request for permission to visit India has been pending for more than 20 years. The due process rights of accused religious minorities have been further diminished by interference with obtaining legal counsel. Attorneys representing Gujarat victims have faced threats, intimidation, and hostility from colleagues. Multiple bar associations have issued official or unofficial resolutions instructing members not to represent terrorism suspects. There have also been reported incidents of harassment and physical violence against lawyers who represent Muslim defendants. In addition, encounter killings or killings that occur during staged clashes between security forces and alleged armed suspects are becoming increasingly common. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Executions reported last year that encounter killings have become virtually a part of unofficial state policy. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief observed after a 2008 visit to India, impunity emboldens forces of intolerance. There is a serious possibility of increased violence against religious minorities in India in connection with the upcoming elections. India cannot abrogate its obligation to protect the human rights of its citizens in the name of national security. The United States and India stand as democratic and pluralistic nations. As such, we must hold each other accountable to the highest standards of human rights protection. We encourage the United States to take strong bilateral and multilateral action to ensure that the rights of religious minorities in India are adequately protected and that India complies with all of its international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman, Mr. Sifton, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you also for inviting me to testify today at this very well-timed hearing. As both you and my co-panelists have already noted, India, like many other countries in the world, is home to a diverse set of religious and ethnic groups. And on most days and in most places in India, members of these diverse groups typically enjoy their basic civil and political rights and their freedom to pursue their beliefs. But unfortunately, that is not always the case. And tensions among communities do exist for various reasons, and these tensions can devolve into violence. What I think it's useful to talk about today is how that happens and what can be done after those devolutions occur. In the run-up to this year's elections, it appears that tensions have escalated, in particular between Hindu and Muslim communities. And as both Representative Pitts and others on the panel have noted, there have been increases in the incidence of communal violence. One of the worst, most recent incidents, of course, involved the mass violence in September 2013 in Uttar Pradesh, events in which at least 60 people died. The events began, of course, with an altercation on September 7th, which led to the deaths of 2 Hindus and a Muslim, and inflammatory speeches by right-wing Hindu leaders and allied groups then led to the 3 days of violence, which spread to neighboring districts. The violence only ended after a curfew was imposed, and the Indian Army was deployed to restore law and order. And in addition to the 60 people killed, at least 6 cases of gang rape and sexual violence were reported, and Muslim citizens from over 150 villages were compelled to flee. How many people are displaced right now is a matter of some dispute. The government claimed in December that it's 5,000. Many groups on the ground are saying it's over 27,000. In the aftermath of that, the government, of course, has failed to provide adequate care for many of the displaced. One of my colleagues visited some of the remaining camps a few months ago, and as we reported at the time, she found displaced Muslims still living in absolutely deplorable conditions and facing shockingly high rates of childhood mortality. This March, the Supreme Court actually issued a ruling that Uttar Pradesh state government had been negligent during the violence by not taking necessary steps to stem it, and they ordered the government to investigate and prosecute persons involved in the violence. I should note here, I should insert, however, that the government failures to address communal violence and displacement after communal violence doesn't just extend to religious minorities and non-Hindus. The government has even failed to ensure that the safe return of Hindus in Jammu and Kashmir, people who were displaced in the 1990s, and that should be mentioned as well. But regardless of how violence is started, and we can talk more about how it is started, whether it's whipped up by politicians or it erupts and government forces don't do enough to stop it from escalating, it is clear that threats of communal violence increase when local forces wait for orders before they act, or worse, when they're not instructed to act. And these governments are compounded when responsible officials after the fact are not held accountable. So India, as other co-panelists have noted, has suffered 3 very major spates of communal violence in recent history. The 1984 attacks on Sikhs in Delhi following the assassination of the Prime Minister, the 1992 and 1993 communal violence in Mumbai, and more recently, the 2002 violence in Gujarat. And in all of these cases, accountability after the fact has proved disappointingly elusive. Indian authorities all too often have failed to properly investigate and prosecute suspects involved in the violence, but also government officials who are complicit either by negligence or direct complicity for taking part. And this pattern of impunity is unfortunately continuing. Although the incidents haven't been as great as the three I just mentioned, I mean, consider, for instance, the violence that occurred in Orissa in 2008, which Dr. Sweat mentioned just now. I mean, the recurring theme in all these is impunity. In all these incidents is impunity. When state authorities fail to investigate these incidents properly, typically what happens is courts or government human rights commissions then step in. They document potential complicity, and they recommend or order state authorities to redouble their efforts to hold people accountable. But even then, the results are often anemic and only partial, incomplete justice at best. So, for instance, for many years after the violence in Gujarat, the state government completely failed to press forward with any comprehensive investigations, and the prosecutions only began after extensive pressure from human rights activists and victims' families, and finally interventions by India's Supreme Court and the National Human Rights Commission. An investigation that was ordered by the Supreme Court to look into Gujarat Chief Minister Modi's role in the violence found no prosecutable evidence of his direct complicity, a conclusion that officials from his party are now using to suggest that he has received a clean chit from the courts. But there are still current legal processes underway in Indian courts initiated by activists and victim families seeking accountability. And independent of the question of Modi's personal complicity, there are issues of culpability of the state government in failing to protect Muslim citizens. And so outside of India, this lack of accountability has led to condemnations, but even travel restrictions for alleged perpetrators, including for Chief Minister Modi, based on the allegations regarding his potential complicity. And Modi is, as others on the panel have noted, now a top candidate to be India's next prime minister. And several countries that have previously suspended any meetings with Modi have now met with him, including the now former but then current U.S. Ambassador Nancy Powell, who met with him in February. We believe that it's appropriate for the United States to continue to press forward with pressing the Indian government for comprehensive accountability, not just for the 2002 events in Gujarat, but for this other serious cases mentioned today. In my written testimony, I've also discussed other matters, including the arbitrary arrests of Muslims in terrorism cases, which was just mentioned, as well as military abuses. These issues are just as important as everything I've already discussed, but I'm going to skip them in the interest of time. I'd be happy to answer questions about the testimony. The main issue for the United States government is how to press forward with its concerns with this pattern of impunity I've talked about. The United States has for many years expressed concern over violence against minorities in India, and Human Rights Watch believes it's important for the United States to reinforce this message even after a new government is elected. So, Human Rights Watch urges the Obama administration, now and after the election, to continue to press India on a number of points. And I'm going to flag three particular ones now. One is India needs to enact a stronger law to prevent communal violence. There is a draft Prevention of Communal Violence bill currently before the Indian Parliament, but it's floundering because of some political parties want to dilute many of its provisions. It's very important that law move forward and not be diluted. The second is to strengthen the existing human rights commissions which exist in India, such as the National Commission for Minorities and the National Commission for Scheduled Castes. These are groups which monitor the rights of religious minorities and Dalits and tribal groups, and there are others that I haven't mentioned. But in some cases, the effectiveness of these commissions has been compromised because the government has staffed them with non-expert or political appointees. It's very important that these commissions have expert commissioners who know how to advance the committee's work. And then third, this matter of disciplining or prosecuting members of the security forces, regardless of their rank, who fail to stop violence or do not act impartially during events of communal violence. One of the best things about the pending bill on communal violence in India's parliament is that it would increase the legal culpability, the legal liability on government actors who fail to stop violence when it occurs. Independent of whether violence breaks out because of local concerns or crime, or whether it's whipped up by political parties or other groups, it is ultimately the government's obligation and responsibility to step in and stop. And you can judge the government's complicity by how long after violence breaks out it is subdued. If it is a few hours, it suggests a certain amount of government responsibility. If it is several days, it suggests government complicity. It's very important that new laws be enacted that put those local actors on the hot seat and have them be held legally liable. So it's good if the it will be good if the United States continues to press forward and convince the Indian government that it's in their best interest to pass that type of legislation. I'd be glad to take more questions. I'll stop there. Thank you for inviting me to testify.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and now recognizes Dr. Dayal for his opening statement.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman and members. My co-panelists have spoken of most of the situation prevailing in India. I come from India to speak, and it's not easy to come from India to speak, apart from distances and money. For the past 1 week, my mailbox has been full of hate mail, which calls me a traitor for having accepted your invitation to come and speak. Last time I spoke here was in 2000, and when I went back home, there was a police case waiting for me on charges of treason. It was thrown out because speaking for the truth is not treason, whether you speak at home, which I do on a daily basis, or you speak in Rayburn Congress Hall in Washington. I'm not going to focus on the issues because my three co-panelists have focused on all of them. I'm going to focus on what are the challenges India will face if elections portend to present a result which is prophesied in newspapers and television columns. What happens if Mr. Modi comes to power? I think we now in India face serious challenges to the secular and pluralistic traditions of our country, and religious minorities such as Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, and Adivasis are genuinely fearful of what the future portends. These fears are compounded by increasing radicalization of the political discourse, including rhetoric about disenfranchising religious minorities. I wish to bring to the attention of the honorable members of Congress the realities of the situation of religious minorities on the ground in India. We have spoken of the anti-Sikh massacres, the Christian massacres in Odisha, and the recent violence in Muzaffarnagar. But in the past 12 months preceding these elections, Christians have themselves faced 153 cases of violence against us. My colleague Vijesh Lal, sitting behind me, is one of the forces noticing, recording these cases. And this is just the proven cases. The numbers may be 10 times as more because it's so difficult for people to say that they have been violated, that they have been beaten up, because the police will just not listen to them. Second, a ruthless and draconian law known as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act has been used to and has led to the incarceration without trial of hundreds of Muslims and Christian youth in several states on charges either of terrorism or of Maoism or acting in any other way which seems to disturb the government of the day and political parties. And wherever the BJP is in power in those states, these cases are many more than other places. We also have seen a very rapid rise in the normally very high rhetoric of the Hindutva Parivar, as we call it. This is not Hinduism. This is a radical, highly politicized form of right-wing extreme forces for whom Hitler was a good man. And this is what is today pushing forth, and they are supporting and emphasizing the political party, the BJP, as it races towards what it thinks is political power in the country, and this is terrible. under a situation, or in a situation where this group were to come to power, what does it portend? They've promised already in writing and in the arguments presented in political discourse, they'll institute anti-conversion laws across the nation along the lines that already exist in 5 states. These states also see a large scale of forcible conversions from Christianity to Hinduism under pretty terrible conditions. Heads are tonsured, you're made to drink cow urine and cow dung, and so on and so forth. We fear that these cases will increase multifold, as we had seen in our experience when these groups came to power in 1998, and were again in power till about 2004. There were many, many, many cases of this sort, and these cases may increase. The use of state machinery and law enforcement apparatus to harass, intimidate, and disenfranchise religious minorities, indulge in mass violence against minorities, followed by extension of impunity to the perpetrators of violence. Government of India itself in Parliament has acknowledged 30,000 cases of violence in the last 60 years on record. Most of these cases have seen no persecution of the perpetrators, including the police and the forces that I have mentioned. This could increase manyfold. Government in Gujarat has already scrapped affirmative action and financial aid to students of Christian and Muslim faith. This may become the national law, and who knows how much damage and injury this may bring to the people of the country, particularly those espousing the Christian and Muslim faith. I will take this opportunity, therefore, to urge the United States government and the US Congress, and indeed all people of the world, to engage in the dialogues with the government of India on issues of human rights and freedom of faith. These rights are guaranteed under the Indian Constitution, but are violated with impunity all too often. India is a huge market and investment destination, and this has so far successfully managed encouraged the government to ignore or rebuff the scant concern shown by the international community, including countries that took part in the Universal Periodic Review hearings in Geneva in 2008 and 2012 to protect the rights of religious minorities. Human rights are universal, and the international community has a special role in ensuring its universal application. May I point out that you're not influencing the Indian elections by holding these hearings today. You're putting on the international limelight the reality of India. You're not exaggerating. We are not speaking anything which is not happening. In fact, for want of our own inability to authenticate on the ground, because we are not allowed to move, the police will not help us, the judges are themselves bigoted, what we tell you is but the very tip of a very massive iceberg, and we would therefore recommend that these concerns be incorporated in the US-India relationship and the US policy vis-a-vis the United States-India Strategic Dialogue, which is the framework of engagement that the US State Department has devised to define its relationship with India. Currently, human rights and religious freedom are excluded from this framework. Although counterterrorism is part of the framework, it must be borne in mind that counter-terror laws in India are implemented in a manner that is repressive towards the minorities, especially the Muslim minority, I may add, but also against the Christian minority in states ruled by the BJP. Also, this position is in contrast to the US policy with respect to China, where the US strategic dialogue does include human rights. The primary aim of House Resolution 417 is to include human rights as part of the strategic US-India dialogue. The RSS, which I spoke of, the Hindutva group, has also an international agenda that is based on a jingoistic concept of undivided India that includes the incorporation of present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. These hardliners pose a heightened risk to the geopolitical stability of human rights in South Asian region, and in fact of the stability and peace in this region. We therefore hope that the US will not allow its soil to be used by resident Indian Hindutva activists who are also involved in the hate campaigns and in collecting funds for the RSS, which has been proven beyond a shadow of doubt in researches in the past. We are in prayer that the people of India and the international community will do what is right in order to safeguard India's tradition of pluralism and secularism. Thank you very much. I think these are very, very important hearings and will have a bearing on how the US looks at human rights things. We in India, the minorities, suffer. But we pray and we work very hard to see that India continues to be a country where we can live in peace and our children can live in peace in the future. I thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and thank you for your courage in speaking out. Now, I will begin questioning. I'll do the first round, then I'll go to my co-chair, and we'll just alternate until we finish. Let me begin with you, Dr. Sweat. You're the vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. What are USCIRF's recommendations to the administration in regards to India?
Well, our key recommendations have to do with more fully integrating, frankly, concern for religious freedom into our bilateral contacts with India at both the federal and the provincial level. And we strongly urge the strengthening of the ability of state and central police to implement effective measures to prohibit and punish cases of religious violence and protect victims and witnesses. We encourage our ambassador to India, as well as other U.S. officials traveling to India, to visit the areas where communal violence has occurred, to meet with religious minority community leaders, local governments, to discuss international religious freedom standards. I think in a broad sense, we feel very strongly that this whole sector of concerns is somewhat sidelined in our dealings with India, and that's a huge mistake, both for our interest in terms of upholding our values, but also in terms of abdicating the role we can have in encouraging India to confront these very serious problems. We recognize and appreciate that India is the world's largest democracy. It's an extraordinary thing to contemplate that 800 million people will be eligible to go to vote in these upcoming elections. It's not easy to democratically govern a society of that size and that complexity and that diversity. But the fact is that democracy is not the end point and the complete answer to the protection of human rights. That's why in our own democratic experiment, our system of government wasn't complete until we had enacted a Bill of Rights that sets parameters on limits on what the government can do and sets a hedge of protection around certain fundamental rights for the individual. So our interest in promoting religious freedom for India is an interest in enhancing, not interfering in their democracy. A couple of other things, if I may be specific again, we also, as one of our recommendations, would like to see our government urge India to increase training on human rights and religious freedom standards and practices for the police and the judiciary. You know, we certainly see, as we look at the situation in India, that where practice breaks down has to do with security forces, the police, and with the judiciary. And this is particularly true in states with a history of or a likelihood of communal violence. We would urge our government to urge the Indian government to press states that have adopted these really problematic anti-conversion laws to repeal or amend them to conform to international standards. And finally, one recommendation we would make to our government is to encourage the Indian government to establish an impartial body of interfaith religious leaders, human rights advocates, legal experts, and government officials to discuss and recommend actions to promote religious tolerance and understanding.
Thank you. Ms. Phillips, just to follow on that response a little bit, to what extent, if any, are Indian law enforcement personnel trained in human rights and religious freedom standards? And if these efforts are underway, are they focused on regions especially vulnerable to communal violence?
I don't know that. I can't list out that. I can research that a little bit more and follow up. I don't know the way the training works. I only know from my own discussions that there is, as I mentioned, an alarming candor about why and how torture is used as an appropriate form of interrogation, which leads me to believe they're certainly not given a directive not to in any form of training, and that they are very confident in the impunity associated with that. So I think that it would take more than training, but a shift in culture where the understanding that international human rights standards do not allow torture in any situation, and that it shouldn't be ever used, and the symbolism of police officers speaking that way publicly and in individual conversations with human rights activists, I think, is reflective of the lack of training and commitment to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Sifton, one direct result of communal violence is the economic marginalization of the victims. Many victims have lost property, they've lost their livelihood, or been severely injured, or in some cases, the head of the house has been killed, leaving women and children with no means of supporting themselves. The inability of groups to provide for themselves creates a dependence on charity or worsens the cycle of poverty. Has the government's response and compensation for victims in the wake of communal violence been adequate? If not, what can be done to improve that situation?
The answer to the first question is no. It hasn't been adequate. In many, many cases, people have been displaced, whether it's Hindus from Jammu in Kashmir, or most recently, Christians from Orissa, or Muslims from Uttar Pradesh, or in Uttar Pradesh. It has not. But that raises an interesting point, which is critics of this hearing or of these concerns that are being raised might see the underlying motivations as political. There are concerns about the BJP and some of its the groups that stand behind it, like the RSS. But the fact of the matter is Congress itself has some very, very big problems and a poor record on religious violence. We've spoken today about the violence against Sikhs in 1984. I can add to that the disturbing counterinsurgency record of the Congress government against the Sikh rebellions that ran from the early 1980s through the 1990s, in which tens of thousands of Sikhs were disappeared. These are Congress party obligations that were not met, and the failure of accountability in those events is a stain on the party's record and its human rights record. So this really isn't a political issue. This is about the government taking more seriously their obligations to protect religious minorities, whoever they are. On what the U.S. should do, I got to say, it's no secret that U.S.-India relationships right now are not wonderful. It's in a very bad spot right now. But it's very vital in that context that doesn't translate into a diplomatic posture by the United States where the U.S. government soft pedals or pulls punches. There's a lot that the United States can do, even with a bad relationship, to voice these concerns and also to coordinate with other capitals. The State Department is not very good at this, but doing better in coordinating with Brussels and the EU external affairs folks, the foreign policy of the EU, so that they also are pressing on these issues, and other governments are singing from the same song sheet about these concerns. It's not just about the U.S. and India. It's about every country and democracy in the world that's concerned about human rights in India and religious liberty in India saying to India the same thing, which is that we want to see your record on this issue get better.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. You want to go first and then take your phone call? Is that all right with you? Yeah. Mr. Ellison has to make a phone call, but let me briefly yield to him for his first round of questions, and then I'll go back to mine. Chair, recognize Mr. Ellison for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to apologize to the panel. I do have to take a phone call in a few minutes, but I will return. This is a very important matter, of course, and I do appreciate your time in coming here. Of course, Dr. Dayal coming so far away to testify. We are very gratified by your efforts, sir. And I'd just like to ask you a question preliminarily. Today is the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, who represented a group of minorities in the United States and who fought for equality for those minorities and, as a matter of fact, paid with his life in that effort. The world Martin Luther King saw and lived in is very different from the one we live in today. I think Americans across this nation of whatever political party are very proud that the United States is a country that could elect a person who's of African descent. And he won first in Iowa, which is an almost all-white state. And yet, Martin Luther King would probably be surprised. I mean, he'd probably be amazed, not surprised, but amazed to see that kind of development in that shorter period of time. And I guess my question to you is this. When you arrived and you had to answer charges that questioned your loyalty and love for India, did you ever get the sense that what you were doing is actually the greatest patriotic act for India, to try to help India be the best India it could possibly be?
I so believe, and therefore here I am. I love Hindus. My brother and my sister are married to Hindus, and so is my son. But I also have a grandson called Kabir. He's a Catholic like me. I worry about his future in the India that he'll grow up in. And that gives me courage to speak. Will he grow up in a country where there's hatred, which can never dream of a Muslim prime minister? You can dream of a president of African descent. Can we dream? Are we not living in a country where state after state have no Muslim representation in the BJP, where Muslims are grossly underrepresented in parliament, in the police force, in the secret service, but grossly overrepresented in jails, as are Christians? 3 times our population, our youth are in jail under the Unlawful Activities Act. I live in that country, but I'm proud of its tradition. And I worry about this contradiction. The greatest democracy with a terrible record, a country with free speech, and yet human rights defenders are in terrible plight. Teesta Setalvad is threatened with jail. Shabnam Hashmi is harassed. Harsh Mandar is abused. Seema Mustafa is abused. Vijesh Lal is abused. John Dayal is threatened. We live in a country of contradictions, but we don't want to continue to live in a country of contradictions. We want there to be peace. We want this India to hold its head high with a distinguished human rights record, not live in a situation where you define Indic religions and alien religions. I'm an alien in my own country, am I? I refuse to be an alien in my country. I would like to live with honor. I would like Kabir to live with grace and with hope. And therefore I speak.
You know, another quick question. I think that some people who would accuse a person like you of disloyalty or something like that, they are laboring under the false impression that to sort of root out these real problems is, or for the country to have problems, is a dishonor to the country. But in fact, there's no country that has not had serious problems.
Indeed.
And so what would you say to those people who are under the impression that somehow you're jeopardizing India's image by bringing these problems to light and trying to seek justice?
Every time a Sikh is troubled for his turban in France, the Prime Minister of India speaks and phones up the President of France. Every time a Sikh is killed in a hate crime in the US, there's an outcry in India. We are one large village, the US and India and the whole world. And we have a right, in fact, a duty to speak when anybody from any faith or any color or any dispensation or curly hair or not. I'm more dark complexion than you are. But we must speak for each other. And therefore, I don't deem myself, they may call me a traitor, I don't call myself a traitor, I call myself a patriot. And I remember that if Luther was killed, Gandhi was killed long before him by people who foment hate, who loved Hitler. They loved Hitler, they hated Gandhi.
I'd like to ask the panel to excuse me for a moment. I'll take a call and be right back.
Thank you indeed.
Yes, sir.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for any opening statement or questions he'd like to make.
Thank you. I want to commend my 2 colleagues who have been able to devote more of their day to this hearing. I want to commend Katrina Lantos Sweat for everything she's done for human rights. was an honor to sit next to her father for so many years, and his record on human rights is world known around the world. He focused with even particular attention on the Jewish people around the world. I think that India has had a very good record as far as treating its small Jewish population, and unlike some other Asian countries that have virtually no Jewish population, we haven't seen anti-Semitic comments from leaders of any stripe as we have in other parts where the comments are made even by leaders who have not met a Jew in their own country. Every country can improve its treatment of religious minorities. I don't know if we've mentioned it, Mr. Chairman, but the bill to create a special envoy in our State Department to focus on religious minorities in South Asia and the Middle East would be helpful to our policy. Let me see. My eyes are not as good as they used to be. But John, can you comment about how India's treatment of religious minorities compares to others in the South Asian region?
John Sifton or John Dayal?
John Sifton.
I think it's a very tough question. Working on all of South and Southeast Asia, we see a lot of troubled countries. Malaysia, Indonesia, against even their own Muslim Shia and Ahmadiyya faith. So we don't get into the matter of comparing countries. It doesn't really help advance the concerns that outsiders have. What I would say is that the promise of India, its unique historical background, its constitution, would almost dictate that it have one of the best records in the region. And yet, sadly, that's not the case.
You're saying it doesn't have one of the best records in its own region, or?
Yes. I mean, what I'm saying is, given its historical background, its constitution, and the way it was founded and everything else, you would hope that it would lead, it would be a leader in the region. I'm not saying it's the worst in the region, but I'm saying it hasn't been a leader. Setting an example.
If the region is South Asia, I mean, I've served on the Foreign Affairs Committee for almost 18 years, heard about religious discrimination in the other parts of South Asia, that is to say Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Are you saying that, and that's a region that is quite large in terms of the number of people when you include India, but is not large in terms of the number of countries. But are you saying that India doesn't compare favorably to Pakistan and Afghanistan?
No, I'm saying it's not living up to its promise.
Yes.
Based on its historical background. It could be a leader, it could set an example for the entire region, and in this it has singularly failed. The promise, though, has been betrayed in many different ways. From the Congress Party's deplorable record with respect to violence against Sikhs, to its failure of economic stewardship, which has hurt Muslim and other religious minorities disproportionately, although it's hurt, frankly, all Indians, to the BJP's ideological background, which is, as my co-panelist says, quite frightening. It's been a huge disappointment, given the history and given the background.
Yeah. Well, the history it shares with Bangladesh and Pakistan, where I think its record is considerably better. But I agree, we have India's the largest democracy in the world, and we're looking for leadership from India in so many ways, including treatment of religious minorities. What do you think, what changes do you think, and I'll address this to the entire panel, could be made look, every country even if it achieves the best possible statutes, and I think our First Amendment does a pretty good job, doesn't achieve complete equality and absence of discrimination and hate crimes on the ground. But you try to improve the statutes. What statutory change, and I'll address this to the other John, but to everyone else on the panel, what statutory changes could be made by the Parliament in Delhi to improve protection of religious minorities?
Congressman, first I would like to answer the question you addressed to my colleague here. Mm-hmm. It is no honor to be compared to Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka in South Asia. India must be judged for itself. Point one. Point two, the numbers in India are huge. If you say all Hindus are very good, and I totally concur, 99% of the Hindus are excellent, but that 1% or the 1.01% of a billion is millions of lunatics out there. And that won't do. India, I think, today must be judged for itself, for its record. Why are there no Muslims in the senior echelons of the police? It's a question that needs to be addressed. And I think it needs to be told to the government of India by us, and we tell it every day, and so must you. We must bring out the communal violence and targeted violence prevention bill, because that holds people responsible. It ends impunity and immunity to the government. It asks for a transparency in its treatment of minorities, and it asks for reparations and relief on a scientific basis. Why is one widow given $1 million, the next one given $100,000, and the last widow given only a few $100? Is one widow more grieved than the other widow? And they're victims of the same violence. There must be a national law, and this comprehensive law was supposed to be that. It has been murdered. It has not been allowed to come before Parliament in India. We must
let me interrupt you and address the other panelists. Do you see this parliamentary proposal as helpful? And it's up to the Indian legislature to adopt laws for India, but do you have any comments on it to either proposed improvements or general support? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to first say I think that all of the laws that are a result of looking at gaps in human rights protection are hugely important and should be supported. But that being said, India has very strong laws that are being violated every day: murder, rape, assault, all the things that are wrapped up into communal violence. There are laws against those. There are laws under which all of these people who have committed the crimes could be prosecuted. And so I think talking about full implementation of the laws, the Constitution, those are all hugely important, and that sometimes in looking at law reform, we get sidetracked, with hand-wringing, if only there was a law, when there's so many laws that can be used to protect the human rights of people, and we spend enormous amounts of time trying to work with judges and police officers and prosecutors in our work to implement the laws that are there. So I'd like to just encourage the discussion of that. And if I could just add one thing not in response to your question, I just would like to say if there's a way to elevate the discussion, I think I'm very concerned about Dr. Dayal and all the others that he mentioned in India, and that I think the United States can be a very good example of how we can be enormously proud of our democracy, enormously proud of the diversity and culture and art and things that come that are important to us in this country, and still shine a light on our own human rights violations, strengthen the civil society organizations that protect that. And if we can do that, if we can have an elevated discussion that honors the beauty and the wonderfulness of India, but looks at the human rights violations, I think that's important and will help protect the human rights defenders there who play such an important role.
Yes, I would like to just bring up one point that I think you might not have heard, Congressman, because Robin brought it up before you joined us, and that relates to this question of how does India match up in its neighborhood. The Pew Research Center earlier this year maintained India on its list of countries with very high social hostilities involving religion. And actually, on a 10-point scale, I think their most recent rating of India on social hostilities, these are not governmental restrictions relative to religious freedom, but the tenor of the society was 9.6 on a scale of 10. So I think that does indicate that while not all of this is government-driven, the impunity, the lack of accountability that my colleagues have spoken about has created a scenario where India is not yet off the chart, but it's right there at the top of the chart in terms of the seriousness and the threat posed by these social hostilities. I also would like to just say a word. You know, we have said many times, and it really bears repeating, that no country is perfect. My late father, who came to this country out of the horrors of the Holocaust and also the horrors of communism, repressive communism in his native Hungary, nonetheless often described American history as a process of gradually closing what he referred to as the hypocrisy gap, the gap between our extraordinary high ideals and the reality. But it is the mark of a society that is moving in the right direction, that they seek to close that gap, that they are step by step, year by year, wanting to close that gap. India shares with us as a democracy a responsibility to be committed to closing the hypocrisy gap, to be committed to living up to their high ideals. And we do them no favor by giving them a pass when they have fallen short. I think all of us are incredibly moved by the testimony of Dr. Dayal and by the personal risks that he is willing to take. But India, you know, again, just taking a little insight into what I believe is an undue defensiveness about some of the issues being raised. USERF, long before my joining the commission, and you know, so this predates my participation as a USERF commissioner, has sought the opportunity to go to India to meet with groups, to make an assessment on the ground, and we've been sort of absolutely shut down. That, to me, indicates a degree of defensiveness that we don't find in other societies with, frankly, even worse records, but they at least are willing to sort of say, okay, come, look around, talk to people, we'll meet with you. So I think that those of us who have great admiration for India and great mindfulness of the extraordinary challenges faced by Indian society, in a way do them the honor of saying there are standards you should choose to live up to because they are embedded in who you are.
No country is going to achieve the ideal. We tend to focus here on trying to improve governments rather than the souls and hearts of individuals. And the government of India has a tough job. You've got a society with, as you point out, a 9.6. It is harder to govern India than it is to govern Canada. It is harder to create ethnic harmony in Rwanda than it is in Switzerland. And you have a history on the subcontinent, a culture on the subcontinent, and that has been difficult for India to achieve harmony among religions. And then you look at Pakistan, and I'm not sure they're even trying. I know that Tulsi Gabbard was here earlier, and was concerned about the timing of these hearings. I think any attempt by us in this room to have any effect on the Indian election would backfire, and that I would say the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom lists as countries of particular concern Tier 1 virtually every country that India shares a border with. They list as Tier 2 Afghanistan, which is the only country in the South Asian region as defined by many that India doesn't have a border with. And the Indian government inherits a situation where you have a number of religious groups that do not have a history of always living peacefully together, although there are many periods in time when they have, when they do indeed have a history of harmony. But a 9.6 is hard for a government to deal with. I'll place in the record, I don't know if it's already been done, a statement by this HAF. It presents a pro-Indian government view. I do that knowing that it is not the only thing in the record of this hearing.
It's been placed.
Oh, it's already been placed in the record. Okay. And that no one document submitted can present all the relevant views on this important issue. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the time. I wish I could spend more time here, and I want to commend those of my colleagues who have spent more time here. I want to commend the Lantos Commission, and especially his daughter, Katrina, and yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Let me now go to Dr. Dayal. You brought this up in your testimony. The BJP party, originally the political arm of the RSS, and they have advocated Hindutva, or India based on Hindu culture, and views this as key to nation building. And in 2002, the BJP-led federal and the Gujarat state governments both came under harsh criticism for playing allegedly enabling roles in the large-scale anti-Muslim violence. And states with BJP governments are far more likely to have anti-conversion laws. How might a BJP government in New Delhi affect the course of communal relations in India in the coming years? Are you concerned that India's long-held identity as a secular, pluralist nation could come under threat? Why or why not? And what specifically might members of Congress or the administration do to address this issue?
I'm deeply concerned. Not only I, a very large number of very sane and very conscientious Hindus are deeply concerned at the BJP thirst for power. It was in power in India between 1998 and 2004. And what happened? 36 churches were burnt in Gujarat. The 2002 riots took place in Gujarat. In Odisha, the Australian missionary Graham Stuart Staines and his teenage sons, Timothy and Philip, were burnt alive. Father Christoraj of the Catholic Church was gored to death. We have experience of what the BJP does when it is government. Groups penetrate the police, groups penetrate the judiciary, groups penetrate the media, and the impact is there long after the government has ceased to be, and the government has taken to power. But the seeds it has sown of hatred, of impunity, continue. At this juncture, if they were to come back to power, in a very factitious society, where 2002 justice is still a major cry, where Kandhamal 2008 justice is still not there at all. I've listed what we anticipate would happen. It is not just that the anti-conversion laws, so-called, would be made national. For Christians, we're a small minority and we're used to all this. But what is going to happen to the millions of youth who are likely to end up in jail under all sorts of charges? What's going to happen there? What is going to happen for opportunities? Don't they have a share in the growth and development of India? I have demanded repeatedly, and my colleagues in India, an equal opportunity commission. And nobody wants it. Only the people want it. Why don't we have an equal opportunity commission in India? Why can't we, in transparency, ask what is the representation of Muslims and Dalits, the untouchables, in governance? What is the ratio in industry and trade and business? The Congress is not the most holy or the cleanest of governments, but still there is a hope There's a hope even under communist governments. But governance without ethics, without emotions, without justice is not a governance we want. Development which adds to these things is not a development we want. Justice, equality, inclusiveness. We are all citizens of this great country, and it is a great country. Let it remain great.
Thank you, Dr. Sweat. In your written testimony, you mentioned India's fast-track courts. Can you elaborate on the effectiveness in addressing religious freedom violations or communal violence in India of these courts?
I think, unfortunately, the verdict is that the courts have not been terribly effective. And some of the elements contributing to that lack of effectiveness that have been identified are that they are plagued by a degree of religious bias and a degree of corruption. The courts have been used inconsistently, and they have had really insufficient capacity to investigate and prosecute cases. And more broadly, you look at India, and they have a pretty creaking and antiquated judiciary system. And when we have, on occasion, had the opportunity to have informal conversations with folks from the Indian government, they will themselves point to that and say, you know, we have a problem with our judiciary. It's not functioning the way we need it to function for a society of our complexity. But you know, we would identify political corruption, religious bias, very often at the local level that has hampered the effectiveness of these fast-track courts. And then there are more concerning aspects. There have been suggestions that witnesses are intimidated, that evidence is lost, that there is a lack of cooperation and transparency in some of these prosecutions. And whenever you see this lack of transparency, a lack of cooperation, it raises a red flag, inevitably, when records are destroyed relative to an investigation, phone records and other evidence that could help establish facts and prove a case. When those elements disappear, then it does not raise one's confidence level that justice is being done and that the full facts are coming forward. So I think the intent behind establishing fast-track courts was the right intent, but the execution and the implementation has fallen short for some of the reasons that I've suggested, and probably some of my colleagues may know more even than I do about this.
Okay, we'll go to the rest of the panel and maybe expand in what ways India is trying to combat religious extremism and communal violence, and are their methods effective? Who would like to respond? Dr. Dayal.
I wish to speak a sentence or two on this issue of the fast-track courts and justice in Odisha or in Gujarat. The fast-track courts became a farce because the victims, there was no witness protection program. The police investigation was extremely shoddy. In thousands of cases, the cases that were actually brought before the courts were very, very few. Out of 120 murders that took place, only 40 were taken cognizance of. Of that, 32 were actually tried, in which there was conviction only in 2 cases, and only in 1 case of murder was there conviction. I and my groups have taken these cases to the Supreme Court of India, asking for a retrial, asking for a situation where the victims can also speak in court, that they can be represented by counsel, which was not done in the past. We have to go to the Supreme Court for every little thing, because the local courts, the lawyers are not there. The local courts will not try. In the case of the rape of the nun, the Catholic nun, we had to go to the Supreme Court because the recording magistrate was trying to play funny. He was chastised by the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the High Court intervened, and then the girl got justice. People were sentenced, 2 of them were sentenced, 1 for the actual rape, the rest for them. But even there, for want of witness protection, this fast-track courts were fast, but fast in acquitting, not fast in investigating. The investigation was extremely shoddy, and we have asked that all those cases be retried, tried again.
Mr. Sifton?
Yeah, I would add just a general point about some of the things India is suffering from that need to change, and I would discuss it by discussing some of the things that have to change in the United States. I think both India and the United States are both very insular countries. Neither of them like outsiders coming in and telling them what to do and how to do it. And that's reflected in the United States not always being entirely open to UN special rapporteurs coming here. And it's relevant for India in the same way that it prevents outsiders from coming in and allowing the cross-fertilization of efforts. Consider for the fact that, there's been talk of Martin Luther King, there's been talk of civil society in India. Consider for the moment that no social justice in any country happens without civil society pushing it through lawyers and civil society groups pushing a government to improve itself. And yet in India, there are laws like the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which make it extraordinarily difficult for outsiders to help fund Indian nonprofits. It's an incredibly tangled set of laws and regulations which make life very difficult for civil society groups in India. As a result, although you have a very vibrant civil society in India, it is less centralized, less unified, and a little bit more anemic than it otherwise would be if there wasn't this law, which is why we have pressed the United States and other countries to press India on this. But on the U.S.-India relationship generally, I think both countries could learn a lot from each other. There's a statement from the Sikh Coalition today here. The Sikh Coalition is a group here in the United States which presses the United States government to improve its treatment of Sikhs in America and advocates for change from law enforcement agencies and federal agencies. Groups like that in India and in the United States, cross-fertilizing is something that both countries could improve. Generally, the U.S.-India relationship could be strengthened by more exchanges, encouraging both civil societies and governments to learn from each other. I'm always surprised when I see how anemic the cross-fertilization is among the U.S. and Indian judiciaries, law enforcement. I mean, it takes place, don't get me wrong, but it's much more anemic than you would expect from two great democracies. And so that's something I would really encourage the State Department and the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to work together on. In the midst of this quite bad relationship that has cropped up in the last couple of months, this might be a way forward into strengthening the relationship.
And I'd just like to add, building on that a lot of attention is paid to the more dramatic incidents of communal violence, and that the statute that Mr. Sifton mentioned, there are other things that feel less dramatic for people to look at, but cause huge problems and are part of what builds the pressure between these big incidents, I believe. Things like the interference with counsel and detention without charge, and the other due process rights that don't get as much attention. And so building on these connections and supporting the groups within India that are looking at how to bridge the gap, how to fix the issues of these day-to-day due process problems that aren't getting enough attention.
Thank you. Well, this has been a very, very informative hearing, many constructive suggestions. I'd like to thank the witnesses for all of your testimony. I'd like to thank Mr. Ellison for co-chairing. And I would like to thank you for all of your important work, both here and abroad. Having heard the testimony, I must reiterate the need for our administration to engage with India at this time. The grievances of victims do not wash away with a new government or an election. And as our State Department has continued to express that the Indian government must continue to seek justice for victims of communal violence, let it not stop. Let the Indian government stop this decline of vigilance against communal violence and ask that it root out this growing impunity that we heard of today. The recommendations and policy changes for both governments are at their disposal. Members of this Congress will be vigilant and ready and willing to work with any government that the Indian government people choose. And so we thank you for your testimony for the record, and we're being called to another vote on the floor. So unfortunately, at this time, we must adjourn. So without objection, this hearing is adjourned.